Okay, we are ready to continue next to nervous tissue. Now, before we start talking about nervous tissue, let's just review the four primary tissue types. We started talking about epithelium. We next covered connective tissue, and now we're on to nervous tissue, and we'll conclude with muscle tissue. Now, just let's spend a second reviewing epithelium. When we talked about epithelium we found covering structures, forming membranes. And in fact, we talked about the membranous structure lining the air sacs of the lungs. That was simple squamous epithelium, really good for diffusion of gases, respiratory gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide from the lungs and into the blood and vice versa. We also talked about the epithelium that lines the GI tract, the simple columnar epithelium. We also found epithelium lining the respiratory tract, and we talked about it as being that pseudostratified columnar epithelium that is sometimes ciliated. It has those hair-like extensions that extend from the surface, and I know you're excited to see that underneath the microscope. We looked at simple cuboidal epithelium as well, that makes up many of our glands, that is important for secretion as well as some absorption. And then we looked at epithelium that covers the outside of our body, and we found that it had to be tougher. So it had cells that were keratinized, and so we found stratified squamous epithelium. And so we found those multiple layers that makes up the epidermis. And then we looked at epithelium that can stretch, that transitional epithelium of the urinary bladder and the ureter. When we looked at connective tissue, we stopped really looking so much and describing the tissue by its cells, and we looked at the stuff outside of the cells. So we looked at connective tissue proper, dense and loose varieties. We also looked at cartilage, and then bone and blood. We found that there was a lot of diversity among connective tissues, between connective tissues that were really hard and solids like bone, to connective tissues that were more gel-like, as in hyaline cartilage. And then, altogether different, we found blood as a liquid. We found formed elements, red blood cells, white blood cells, and thrombocytes suspended within that liquid matrix, which we call plasma. Next, we're going to look at two types of tissues, nervous tissue and muscle tissue. And these are what we'd call reactive tissues. We can stimulate them, and we get a response. In fact, nervous tissue is responsible for stimulating muscle tissue. So these tissues are excitable. Now, let's look at nervous tissue first before we get ahead of ourselves. When we look at nervous tissue, let's first start talking about it by where we'd anticipate finding nervous tissue. Well, it's almost right in its name. We would find it comprising things like nerves, right? If I could spell it, N-E-R-V, nerves. Okay. We'd find it in the brain, also in the spinal cord. We find nervous tissue throughout our whole body because most, in fact, all of our organs, I should say most, not every tissue is well innervated, but most tissues are innervated, are connected to the brain via nerves. So we find nervous tissue in a lot of places throughout the whole body. Okay, now, in nervous tissue we have a couple of cell types, okay? So we'll talk about cell types. We have the actual cells that are responsible for transmitting information, sending and receiving signals. We call those neurons. We can also call them nerve cells. We have other cells that support those nerve cells, and we call them neuroglia literally translated nerve glue, or we sometimes call them glial cells. Now, when we start talking about the nervous system in a couple of weeks, we are going to be able to spend lots of time describing those different types of supporting cells. But for now, we'll just kind of make a little statement that these support neurons. They do things like make sure that neurons have enough nutrients, and they keep harmful substances away from neurons. They also are involved in making sure that there is adequate quantities of neurotransmitters. They have lots of supportive function, although we do not consider them to be directly responsible for the communication of information. Okay? Let's look at a neuron. Let's look at a neuron and just in a real simplistic way describe its parts. Neurons have a main portion called the cell body, also called the soma. Please know both of those terms. And the soma has a nucleus, and inside the nucleus we find DNA. Okay, there's a nucleus. It also has lots of other organelles. It has like a Golgi, well-defined Golgi apparatus. It has other structures like ribosomes, and we'll talk more about those when we lecture discussing cell biology or cytology. Okay, now we have moving away. Typically, it can be kind of moving a long way away from the cell body and directing impulses away from the cell body. We have what's called an axon. So an axon is a neuron process that transmits a nervous impulse, what we'll call an action potential, but you can just say it transmits information at this point away from the cell body. And then we have structures, and there are lots of them, typically. Now, they're all different types of neurons with different configurations, but we'll draw a really simple variety. This neuron right here, or this part of the neuron, I should say, what I'm drawing, these are all called dendrites. And dendrites bring information back toward the cell body. That's the easiest way to define these processes. Dendrites are neuron processes. Axons are also neuron processes. Each neuron only has one axon, but it can have hundreds and thousands of dendrites depending on the type of neuron and its location. But dendrites, they bring information toward the cell body. Axons bring information away from the cell body. Okay? And then if you can imagine another neuron cell body here, and we'll draw a dendrite, where a dendrite meets an axon, we have this little space in here, and this is called a synapse. And this is how nerve cells communicate with one another. We have information being sent to the cell body, distributed then through the axon where it meets another neuron, or it could meet a muscle, or it could meet a gland. And there is this region called the synapse, and then information is then spread to the next neuron. And I'm talking about this in very, very generic terms. We will spend more time discussing this with more specific mechanisms of physiology later on in this course. So, here's a neuron. Here is the cell body. We have examples of dendrites, and here's an example of an axon. And we'll spend a minute looking at some neurons and some glial cells under the microscope next. Okay, we're ready to look at some neural tissue or some nervous tissue. Let me back up a little bit here. So just to give you a little perspective, what we're looking at is the outside of the brain. This would be called the cerebral cortex. And so we can see, if you remember looking at a brain ever, you see all those convolutions, those ridges, and then the grooves, the gyri, and then the sulci, or singular gyrus and a sulcus. We'll talk about those more in the nervous system section. But let's take a look and kind of zoom in and see what we can find. And you can notice already, you can see some blue lines that are kind of streaking through the image. We'll keep zooming in. Oh, look at, they're becoming more obvious now. These blue lines, those are processes. More than likely, what we're looking at here are axons. And so we're looking at one of the processes of a neuron with each of those blue lines or streaks. Now, as we continue zooming in, we see lots of different circular structures, and more than likely most of these are glial cells, or those supporting cells. They outnumber the neurons significantly. Let's pan through to see if we can find a really good example of a soma, or cell body. We'll have to wait for it to catch up a little bit here. Here's a good example of a neuron cell body. We can see taking up that blue stain still, just like the processes are. It starts to become wider and more dense. This is a good example of a neuron cell body. Now, admittedly, this particular specimen is not the most obvious section or slide showing nervous tissue that we can see. And I'm going to pull up another example from another resource for you coming up next. Let's take another look at some neurons. And what I did is I just did a quick Google image search here, and just type in neuron smear, and you will find, now be careful with this, you can't just accept everything that comes up at face value, but yeah, you will see here we have multiple examples of nervous tissue, and we can especially see in some of these, like right here and here, these are the neuron cell bodies, and then projecting away are the processes, okay, the nerve processes, including axons and dendrites. Now, most of these will be dendrites. And you can scroll through these and find some examples. Here is another good one here. Admittedly, the University of Michigan's website, it's fairly difficult to find great examples of isolated neurons on those particular slides. But I just wanted to show you that they were there, and you can definitely see nerve processes. Cell bodies are not brought into resolution with as much detail